He walked into the military academy offering to share old war stories with young cadets. 73 years old, wearing a simple flannel shirt and walking with a slight limp. The instructor smiled politely but didn't take him seriously. Just another old veteran living in the past. Then he started talking about jungle warfare, and everything changed. What the cadets heard next would reshape everything they thought they knew about real combat. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of forgotten heroes and hard-earned wisdom, tell me in the comments, from which city around the world are you watching today? And if you believe the lessons of war should never be forgotten, hit that subscribe button. This story will change how you see both war and the men who fought it. The letter arrived at Fort Braxton Military Academy on a Tuesday morning in March, handwritten on simple stationery, addressed to the commandant's office. The secretary, Captain Sarah Mitchell, almost threw it away with the usual stack of veteran correspondence. Most were requests for base tours or complaints about military policy, but something about the careful handwriting made her pause. Dear Colonel Stevens, it read, "My name is Robert Bear Thompson. I served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1971 with the 1st Infantry Division. I've been following news about your Academy's new combat readiness program, and I believe I might have some experiences that could benefit your cadets. I'm not asking for compensation or recognition, just the opportunity to share what I learned about warfare in hopes it might keep some of your young soldiers alive. Respectfully, Robert Thompson." Captain Mitchell set the letter aside and made a note to mention it to Colonel Stevens. The Academy received dozens of similar offers every month, well-meaning veterans who wanted to share their stories. Most were given a polite thank you letter and a suggestion to contact the local VFW. But Colonel Stevens was different. A West Point graduate with 3 tours in Afghanistan, he understood that academic military training, no matter how sophisticated, could never fully replicate the reality of combat. He'd lost too many young officers who knew textbook tactics but had never learned to read the subtle signs that kept soldiers alive in real warfare. "Set up a meeting," he told Captain Mitchell. "Let's see what Mr. Thompson has to offer." Robert Thompson arrived at the academy the following Thursday at precisely 1400 hours. He drove a modest pickup truck with a faded Vietnam veteran bumper sticker and parked carefully between the lines in the visitor lot. 73 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches with gray hair and a mustache that had once been military regulation. He wore clean jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that couldn't quite hide the careful way he moved, like someone whose body remembered old injuries. Captain Mitchell escorted him to Colonel Stevens' office, noting how he walked with a slight limp but maintained perfect posture. His eyes were alert, constantly scanning their surroundings with the unconscious awareness of someone who had learned never to let his guard down completely. "Mr. Thompson." Colonel Stevens stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for seeing me, sir," Robert replied. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and he waited to be invited to sit. Small details that marked him as someone who understood military protocol. "Tell me about your service," Stevens said, settling behind his desk. Robert's expression didn't change, but there was a pause, the kind that comes when someone is deciding how much truth to share. "1st Infantry Division, Big Red 1. 3 tours in Vietnam, 68 to 71. Started as a private, left as a staff sergeant. Spent most of my time in the field." Stevens nodded. Standard information, the kind any veteran might share. But something in Robert's tone suggested there was more to the story. "What kind of field experience?" Another pause. "Long-range reconnaissance patrols, small unit operations in contested areas. We spent a lot of time behind enemy lines." Stevens leaned forward slightly. LRP operations were among the most dangerous assignments in Vietnam. Small teams operating independently in hostile territory, gathering intelligence and conducting direct action missions with minimal support. "And you think this experience would be valuable to our cadets?" Robert looked directly at Stevens. "Sir, your academy does an excellent job teaching military theory, tactics, and leadership. But there are things about combat that can't be learned from textbooks or simulations. Things that might save lives if your young officers knew them before they found themselves in a real fight, such as how to read terrain that's trying to kill you, how to move through hostile environment without making sound, how to tell the difference between a local farmer and someone who's planning to put a bullet in your back, how to keep your men alive when everything goes wrong and you're 100 miles from the nearest friendly unit. Stevens was quiet for a moment. These weren't the typical war stories most veterans wanted to share. This was practical knowledge, hard-earned through experience that most people couldn't imagine. "Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to speak to a group of our senior cadets? Nothing formal, just a conversation about your experiences." Robert nodded slowly. "If you think it would help." The session was scheduled for the following week. Stevens selected 20 of his most advanced cadets, seniors who would be commissioned as second lieutenants within months and potentially deployed to combat zones shortly after graduation. He introduced it as a practical warfare discussion with a Vietnam veteran and encouraged the cadets to ask serious questions. Robert arrived early, dressed the same way, jeans, boots, and flannel shirt. He carried a small canvas bag and asked for nothing more than a chair and a glass of water. The cadets filed in expecting another mandatory lecture from an old-timer who would ramble about the good old days and bore them with irrelevant stories from a war that ended before they were born. What they got instead changed everything. Robert didn't start with war stories. He started with a question. How many of you have been in a real firefight? No hands went up. Academic training, simulations, war games, but no actual combat experience. That's good, Robert said quietly, because if you're lucky, you never will be. But if you're unlucky, everything you think you know about warfare is about to be tested in ways you can't imagine. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a simple topographical map. This is a 1 to 50,000 scale map of an area in South Vietnam where my team operated for 8 months in 1969. I want you to look at it and tell me where you would set up a defensive position if you were a 6-man patrol trying to avoid a company of NVA regulars who knew you were in the area. The cadets studied the map, pointing to high ground, clear fields of fire, defensible positions, all the tactics they had learned in their military science courses. Robert listened patiently, then shook his head. Every position you've identified would get you killed within 6 hours. The room went quiet. You are thinking like American soldiers fighting a conventional enemy, but this isn't conventional warfare. This is survival in an environment where the enemy knows the terrain better than you know your own hometown, where every civilian might be gathering intelligence for people who want to kill you, and where the rules of engagement can get you and your men killed if you follow them too strictly. He pointed to a seemingly unremarkable spot on the map. Low ground near a stream, surrounded by dense vegetation with no obvious tactical advantages. This is where we hid for 3 days, while an entire NVA battalion searched for us. Not because it was the best defensive position, but because it was the last place they would look. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting, it's about not being found. For the next 2 hours, Robert walked the cadets through scenarios they had never considered. How to move through triple canopy jungle without breaking branches or disturbing wildlife. How to read the behavior of local populations to identify areas of enemy activity. How to distinguish between actual threats and false alarms when your life depended on making the right decision in seconds. But more importantly, he taught them about the mental aspects of combat that no simulation could replicate. "You'll hear people talk about courage," he said quietly. "But real courage isn't not being afraid. Real courage is being absolutely terrified and still doing your job because your men are counting on you. It's making decisions when you don't have enough information, when every choice could be wrong, and when hesitation will get people killed." A cadet named Johnson raised his hand. "How do you prepare for that kind of pressure?" Robert looked at him for a long moment. "You don't. You can't simulate the feeling of knowing that if you make the wrong decision, people you care about will die. You can train, you can study, you can practice, but until you're actually responsible for lives in a situation where failure means death, you don't really know who you are." The session was supposed to last 1 hour. It went for 3. The cadets asked questions they had never thought to ask, and Robert answered with the kind of specific, practical knowledge that could only come from someone who had lived through situations where survival required more than textbook solutions. As the session ended, Stevens approached Robert privately. "Mr. Thompson, I have to ask, what unit were you with specifically? Your knowledge seems unusually comprehensive." Robert paused, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded military ID card. Stevens looked at it and felt his breath catch. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, 75th Ranger Regiment, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol. Classified Operations, Southeast Asia. Stevens looked up sharply. The 75th Rangers were among the most elite units in Vietnam, conducting deep reconnaissance and direct action missions that remained classified decades after the war ended. "Sir, why didn't you mention this earlier?" Robert put the ID back in his wallet. "Because it doesn't matter what unit I was with. What matters is what I learned about keeping young soldiers alive." Stevens was processing the implications. LRP Rangers were legends in military circles, small teams that operated independently behind enemy lines for weeks at a time, gathering intelligence and conducting missions that conventional units couldn't attempt. "Mr. Thompson, would you consider a more formal arrangement? Perhaps regular sessions with our combat leadership program?" Robert considered this. "I'm not interested in glory or recognition, Colonel, but if you think sharing these experiences could help prepare your officers for what they might face." "I do, and I think you're underestimating how valuable this knowledge is." Over the following months, Robert became an unofficial instructor at the academy, not in formal military doctrine. The academy had plenty of professors for that, but in the practical realities of combat that couldn't be taught from textbooks. One afternoon, Stevens found Robert sitting alone in the classroom after a particularly intense session about casualty evacuation under fire. "There," Stevens said, using the nickname the cadets had given him, "do you ever think about what you accomplished in Vietnam? The missions you completed, the lives you saved?" Robert looked out the window at cadets training on the parade ground. "I think about the ones I couldn't save. The young officers who died because they didn't know things they should have known. That's why I'm here." Stevens nodded. "The Department of the Army has been asking about you. They want to formalize your role, maybe develop a curriculum based on your experience." Robert shook his head. "The moment you make this formal, it stops being real. These boys don't need another academic course. They need to understand what combat actually feels like, sounds like, smells like. They need to know that textbook solutions don't work when people are shooting at you." "Then, what do you want?" Robert stood up slowly, favoring his left leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone 40 years earlier. "I want every young officer who leaves this academy to have the best possible chance of bringing his men home alive. That's all I've ever wanted." As Robert prepared to leave that day, Stevens stopped him one final time. "Bear, there's something I need to know. Your service record, the parts that aren't classified, they list you as having received the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. Why don't you ever mention any of that?" Robert paused at the door and looked back. "Colonel, medals are for the people who didn't come home. The rest of us just try to pass on what we learned so maybe fewer families have to fold a flag." That night, Stevens sat in his office reading Robert's unredacted service record, documents that had required special clearance to access. 3 tours in Vietnam, all with elite Ranger units conducting classified operations behind enemy lines. Multiple citations for valor under fire, leadership in impossible situations, and tactical innovations that were still being studied by special operations units. But more importantly, a consistent pattern of bringing men home alive from situations where survival shouldn't have been possible. Robert Thompson had earned the right to tell war stories, to demand recognition, to trade on his reputation. Instead, he chose to spend his retirement teaching young officers the practical skills that might keep them and their soldiers alive. The next morning, Stevens made a decision. He called the Pentagon and recommended that Robert's informal teaching methods be studied and potentially incorporated into officer training programs nationwide. Not as academic coursework, but as practical preparation for the realities of modern combat. Within a year, Veteran instructors from multiple conflicts were being paired with military academies across the country. The program, officially called Practical Combat Experience Integration, was unofficially known as the Thompson method. But Robert himself continued teaching the same way he always had, quietly, practically, and with the sole goal of helping young officers understand what it really meant to be responsible for the lives of soldiers in combat. Some lessons can't be taught from textbooks. Some knowledge can only be passed down from those who have lived through experiences that test the limits of human endurance and courage. And sometimes, the most valuable teachers are the ones who never sought to teach at all. They just couldn't bear the thought of young soldiers dying from ignorance of things they could have learned. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Thompson? Someone whose quiet expertise and hard-earned wisdom could have changed lives, if only people had been wise enough to listen. Someone who carried the weight of experience, not as a burden, but as a responsibility to help others? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the teachers who never called themselves teachers, the heroes who never claimed to be heroes, and the quiet professionals who spent their lives passing on knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that the most valuable lessons are often taught by those who never intended to be teachers. They just couldn't stand the thought of others learning the hard way what they already knew. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that experience is the greatest teacher and wisdom should never be wasted, subscribe and share. Help us honor those who turn their hardest experiences into hope for the next generation. We'll see you in the next story, and until then, remember, the old soldier sitting quietly in the corner might have more to teach than all the textbooks in the world. Listen carefully, learn humbly, and pass it on.